longest tenured faculty member, I'm pretty sure. She's been here since the beginning. Yes, from the foundation. And she has a lot of wonderful things that she brings to this community. So she will be speaking tonight about some integrations of our Holy Father and the inspiration behind his name in Catholic social teaching. So please welcome Dr. Nielsen.
Thank you, Carolyn. All right, is that good? Can you hear me? All right, fantastic. Well, thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it. It's nice to see all your faces. Before I get started, this just occurred to me on the way here. It's kind of interesting. I wanted to share it with you. When I first became a roller skating car hop, the proprietor already took me back to pick out my number, because you have the numbers that you stick on the windshield. And she said, these are the numbers that aren't being used by any of the girls right now. Take whatever number you want. And they're all ratty and old and root beer stained, except for one stack, which was perfectly pristine, which was the number 13. And I said, why is that one so new? And she said, oh, no one wants to use that one. They think they'll fall because it's unlucky. And being me, I was like, well, then that's the card for me. So then I was 13, and that began my relationship with the number 13, because then St. Anthony, I didn't pick St. Anthony to be my confirmation saint. He picked me. That's another story. But his number is 13, because he died on the 13th, and he died on a Tuesday, and today is Tuesday the 13th. And I don't know what impression you got from the poster, but this talk is actually not on Leo the 14th, it's on Leo the 13th. So I was just like, all these confluences of the number. I have one card left from when I was a car hop. I thought about bringing it as a little show and tell. So that's my first warning. If you were expecting a talk about the new Holy Father, I will talk about him a little bit, but the inspiration for this talk was he chose the name Leo, specifically after Leo the 13th. So maybe let's look a little bit at him to see what the inspiration is. I love Leo the 13th. He is my second favorite pope. And I think John Paul II only has the edge because I have a personal experience with him. Leo the 13th is incredible. And I'm going to ask if you have questions to save them till the end, because I have about 5 talks worth of content here. I'm going to have to skip some things probably. But Leo the 14th said, after he was elected, I chose to take the name Leo the 14th. He was talking to the cardinals when he said this. There are different reasons for this, but mainly because Pope Leo the 13th, in his historic encyclical Rerum Novarum, addressed the social question in the context of the first great industrial revolution. In our own day, the Church offers to everyone the treasury of her social teaching in response to another industrial revolution, and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence that pose new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end, artificial intelligence and the intersection with Catholic social teaching. But first, I just wanted to share some history of Pope Leo the 13th, because he says, among many other reasons. So clearly he knows Pope Leo the 13th, and there are reasons why he's sort of the spirit behind his own papacy. So it starts out with a little history. So I'll probably murder all of these words. I should get Michael to come up here and read this Italian for me. Gioacchino Vincenzo Raffaele Luigi Pecci is his birth name. So he's an aristocrat, because he's got 5 names. Right? He was born in 1810. He was the 6th of 7, because I'm 6 of 7. He loved Latin. He started writing Latin poetry when he was 11 years old. Apparently, they say he was reading Horace before he died, right? Reading Latin poetry. Studied with the Jesuits. He found his vocation at 18 and was very early recognized by the Vatican for his brilliance. He got doctorates in theology, civil, and canon law. Right? So a very intelligent man. When I wrote my dissertation, which is on Catholic social teaching, I read, being the completionist that I am, I read every single biography ever written by him, starting with one that was written while he was alive. And that was fascinating. I checked to see if there are any more recent ones, and the most recent one is a republication of the one written in 1887. But it was interesting because after the 70s, the theologians of the late 70s and the 80s, who I first encountered teaching me about Leo XIII, described him as resistant to modernity and democracy, defensive of the ancient regime, paternalistic, dismissive of the common people. Charles Curran said that Pope Leo XIII hated freedom. I remember thinking that probably can't be true, and that his attitude towards the populace was one of condescension. Right? So there's this image of Pope Leo XIII that was absolutely shattered when I studied what the biographers had said about him up until that time. His career spanned, so first he was, remember the papal states are still in place at this time. So first he was a papal legate to Benevento, the sort of governor of that papal state, and then Perugia. And then he was a nuncio to Belgium, right, like an ambassador for the Holy See. Then he went back to be the Archbishop of Perugia, always these very high positions. Then he was made Camerlengo, which is like the Secretary of State of Vatican City. And from that position, he was elevated to the papacy. He took his own name in memory of Pope Leo XII because he admired Pope Leo XII for his interest in education and his conciliatory attitude towards foreign governments. And you will see that that will be very important. But Leo XIII, we all know him, most people know him for the promulgation of Rerum Novarum, right? Or possibly for writing the St. Michael prayer, right? And this is what people know about him. But his whole life was a life of a reformer. Everywhere he went, he was reforming and improving the lives of the poor. And when he got to Benevento, his first task was to end brigandage because it was overrun with bandits, and these bandits were all in league with the barons. He built new roads, he reformed the customs house, he reformed the taxes. He heard that a baker was selling bread below the standard pound weight, and so he started going down there personally to check the weights of the bread to make sure that they were square. Right? And to his condescension and paternalism, he was a great promoter of education. When he was Archbishop of Perugia, he established the St. Philip Neri Gardens for Youth, which was for recreation and instruction, an academy for girls, a free school for the poor, an industrial school, the St. Dominic School for Incurables, as they were called. He turned the orphanage into a school. And when he found out that the seminarians didn't have anywhere to stay, he reduced his rooms at the Episcopal residence so that the seminarians could all stay there. And on education, because it won't come up later, when he was Pope, he built 29 different schools out of his own funds. So just a great builder of schools, very pro-education, like Leo XII before him. In Perugia, he started a bank with his own capital because he found out that the farmers were at the mercy of usurers and then were being taken for a ride all the time. So he used his own money to start a bank. There was a famine in Perugia while he was there, and he started a soup and bread kitchen out of the Episcopal residence for the poor, which he was very tickled to do because his mother had done the same thing when he was a child out of her house, of course, because she was like this. He was raised in a home like this. They were very wealthy, aristocratic family, but she was always going to the homes of the poor and bringing them food and clothes and medicine. And when she discovered that there was not enough industry for them, she started raising silkworms so that they could have a silk industry and the poor women would have something to do to make extra money. So this is who Leo XIII has been his whole life, right? This this great reformer and with great concern for the poor. So he follows Pius IX. Right? And Pius IX, of course, writing the Syllabus of Errors, the great opponent to modernity, right? Preaching what was wrong with the Enlightenment, what was wrong with all of the changes, what we could not as Catholics accept as part of the changes, right? In philosophy and government and all of these other things. But Pius himself said, shortly before he died, "It is time for me to depart. Other men are needed and other methods. I know there must be a change, but it must be left to my successor. I cannot break now with the tradition of my reign." So he understood what his task was, but he also knew that it wasn't the future, that some sort of change was necessary to follow. And this was a very tumultuous time when Pius IX died. At the end of the 19th century, I talk about the context later, but if someone from the end of the 19th century were here today and we talked about anti-Catholicism, right, they would probably laugh in our faces, right? It doesn't come anywhere near. I mean, all of it was the two-sword theory, the king and the pope were both together, and this was all breaking apart with the rise of democracy and secular government. And these rising secular governments were openly, explicitly, overtly anti-Catholic. They were doing everything. They wanted to erase the Catholic Church. They said they wanted to erase the Catholic Church. Right? They were banning religious orders, confiscating all the church's property, closing all the seminaries. If bishops spoke out, they threw them in jail. Like, they wanted to erase the Catholic Church. And when Pius IX died, people were either celebrating or fearful that that would be the end of the papacy. There was people truly believed that that might be the last pope. When his body was transferred to its burial, which I'm assuming is at St. Peter's, I'm not sure, there were riots in the street. Right? Like, because they thought, like, this is it, the papacy's done, the church is done. Right? And this is the church into which Cardinal Pecci was elected. Right? You can see why. I don't know if you know, there's a room, what's it called, the Room of Tears, where they send the popes to go have a cry after they're elected. And Leo XIII reportedly had quite a long cry after he was elected. Right? The Holy See had no diplomatic relations with any other nation. It had all, the Church of Pius IX and Gregory before him was a bit of a bunker church. They were in defense mode because they were being constantly attacked. The press, it's funny to read about the 19th century. I think to myself, I don't know, are we reliving the 19th century or is it just never stopped? Because the press was really anti-Catholic, and there was just this culmination of this materialistic rejection of faith and even the supernatural at all. But also within the church, we see some similarities to our church today, where everyone always wanted to put everybody into a camp. Right? They're in the liberal camp or in the conservative camp. They're in the clericalist, reactionary, conservative camp, or they were in the liberal, progressive camp. Right? We still do this today. And so it may surprise you and Charles Curran to discover that Cardinal Pecci was not desirable to many because he was considered to be in the liberal camp. He was considered to be a very liberal, progressive, reforming cardinal. Some of his biographers speculate Pius IX wanted to make him a cardinal and then it was postponed, and they say, maybe it was postponed because people were a little concerned about this progressive Cardinal Pecci. The conclave where he was elected, there was a conservative group that actively did not want him elected. Right? They thought he was too modern, he was too averse to the present policy, which was to sort of bunker down. And there was what Cardinal Martinelli was who they wanted, who the conservatives wanted because he was a very holy Augustinian who goes out into the world as little as possible. Right? That's the Pope they were after. They wanted a man, according to one, who had no ideas and just prayed. And that is not who they got with Cardinal Pecci. On the 4th ballot, he was elected. The first thing he did was to intentionally appoint a more progressive Secretary of State. Pope Leo is the one who opened the papal archives, which scared a lot of people, right? That the archives would be open to the public made them very nervous. And his response to this was, there are people who would keep Peter's betrayal out of the Gospels. And he referred to them as testi piccioli, small brains, adding one never need fear the truth. Another great quip from him after Rerum Novarum came out. Rerum Novarum was widely acclaimed, but like any really good encyclical, also everybody criticized it. And so the conservatives criticized Rerum Novarum, and his response to this was, oh, these people are too old for me. And he was like 71, right? Oh, they're too old for me. He's had a real sense of humor. One of my favorite things that he did that startled people was he allowed the priests to ride bicycles, which was very scandalous because the priests were not allowed to ride bicycles. And he was like, well, let them ride bicycles, for crying out loud. Right? Made people nervous. But he wasn't a break, obviously. He wasn't a break from Pius IX. He wasn't like, oh, enough of that. Now let's do this other thing. Right? It's more like, and several of his biographers have described it this way, that Pius IX kind of cleared away the error of modernity. Like, this is what we can't accept. This is what is false. This is where Catholics cannot go. Right? And having done that, now the path was clear for this new pope to move forward. Right? What now is our dialogue with the modern world? Now that we know what we reject, right? How do we engage with the modern world? How do we move forward aggressively? Because, of course, like any pope who's been accused of being liberal, he was just as staunch a defender of dogmatic teaching, right, as any other pope. You know, your normal pope. And ever since then in my life, other than Benedict XVI, new popes get elected and everyone's like, oh my gosh, he's so liberal. I'm like, That's what they said about Leo. So one of the things he did, this I might abbreviate, but it is such a big and impressive part of his papacy. Remember, like, Pius IX had all sorts of trouble with the changing governments who were opposed to the church. He at one point had to flee Rome. At one point he thought about moving the papacy out of Rome because it was so hostile. He had no diplomatic relations with anybody. And his reactions were understandable given the circumstances. But Pope Leo very swiftly reestablished diplomatic relations with every single nation with which the Holy See had lost them, right? And people were startled by the fact that he was willing to work with any government, that he showed equal goodwill to any form of government. And in Immortali Dei, an encyclical he wrote on church-state relations, which we should study as much as we study Rerum Novarum. He really set the tone for what church-state relations would be in a world full of secular government. And he upheld the legitimacy of a wide range of types of government. But it was based upon the idea that people had a right to choose their own government. That it wasn't up to the church to come in and enforce a government on people, that this was something people should decide for themselves. Keeping in mind that we have this bracket of what is not tolerable, right? Within that, people should be able to decide for themselves. Right? The state has a certain autonomy. A comment that he made about Rerum Novarum, people complained about Rerum Novarum as they do about every single social encyclical when it comes out. You may have heard it even about Pope Leo's recent encyclical. I saw many articles saying this. They're not specific. Give me something specific. Tell us what to do. What is the great economy? What is the right this? Give us a specific blueprint. And the church never does, and people are always dissatisfied with this. And Leo said, if I were to pronounce on any single matter of a prevailing economic problem, I should be interfering with the freedom of men to work out their own affairs. Right? It is up to individuals to make these decisions for themselves, right? Using the guidance of the church. But the specifics are for us to determine. Same for government. People are meant to work out their own affairs, right? So he made a lot of room for the autonomy of secular power, but not like the church and the state were these two powerful entities, and the state was this other power that he had to give, the way two states might approach each other, right? As I have power and you have power, and we have to respect each other's power. That wasn't what it was. What he was respecting was the freedom of the individuals within the government, in the country, to choose the leaders that they wanted, to choose the type of leadership that they wanted. Right? It was an affirmation of the people. On the other hand, given that, he was still adamant that looking at social problems, there was no cure, no solution without religion and the church. Right? So it wasn't like, poverty is now your problem, government, or social justice is now your problem, government. He has a great line from Rerum Novarum that I'd like to read for you. He says, we approach the subject with confidence, we meaning him, royal we, and in the exercise of the rights which manifestly appertain to us, for no practical solution to this question will be found apart from the intervention of religion and of the church. It is we who are the chief guardian of religion and the chief dispenser of what pertains to the church, and by keeping silence we would seem to neglect the duty incumbent on us. Doubtless this most serious question demands the attention and the efforts of others besides ourselves, to wit, of the rulers of state, of employers of labor, of the wealthy, aye, of the working classes themselves for whom we are pleading. But we affirm without hesitation that all the striving of men will be in vain if they leave out the church. And Rerum Novarum proceeds from that first claim, right? So the state has its tasks, and it's autonomous in those tasks, and people need to make decisions about their own governments, but none of that will accomplish anything without religion and the church. Right? That's where the ultimate answers will come from. Right? But this also leads to another issue of church-state relations that we still deal with today, that he and Catholic social teaching in general do not intend the church herself to be political. In Cum Multa, he argues that the church cannot be separated from society. It's an argument against what we would now call the naked public square. Right? The church shouldn't be political, but it should be involved. It has to have a voice in the direction that the world takes. But to his progress, and working our way slowly towards artificial intelligence, he was a great embracer of progress, right? So before Leo, like I say, there was this strict rejection of the Enlightenment, a strict rejection of liberal democracy, and of industrial capitalism, right? Strict rejection. And he, in his progress in moving forward, wanted to reconcile the church with this new reality. And this included science, because the rejection of modernity tended to include this rejection of technology, a rejection of science, and the advances being made in the Industrial Revolution. They wouldn't, former popes had banned gas lighting, right, and rejected the expanse of the railways. And it was one of the first things, in addition to priests getting to ride bicycles, he put gas lights in the Vatican. Like he showed up and he's like, well, that's stupid. and embraced, the gaslighting technology that others had been resisting. And he'd always been this way. As Cardinal Pecci, one of his last pastoral letters as cardinal was on science and Galileo, defending the church against this accusation that it was anti-progress, anti-modern science, to convince people that it was not. He himself was fascinated by technology. It's trying to decide. That's one of the reasons, I'll just say as an aside to those who are interested, because of course we also know him as the one who brought St. Thomas Aquinas back as the leading theologian of the church. And one of the reasons that he did, it's kind of funny, you think about St. Thomas always being there, but he wasn't. He was collecting dust by the end of the 19th century. And when he discovered St. Thomas, when he was studying with the Jesuits, he just heard about him, and he had to write home to his parents and say, can you send me a copy, find me a copy of this book by the St. Thomas guy. I hear he's really important, But one of the reasons he was really attracted to St. Thomas, it wasn't just for the sound theology. It was for Thomas's harmonizing of faith and reason, because that was a big problem. That's what Thomas was working out, too. That was an issue in his time. Right? So Thomas offered a way to bridge this gap between faith and reason. So very pro-science, which we will get back to part of his progressive perspective. So now I get to Rerum Novarum. I'm slowly just laying the bricks for why does Leo XIV think this is our model for tackling AI. After he was elected, the first letter he found on his desk was from this Saint Simonian who said, you have to address the social problems of today. The church has to say something about this. Right? And he always kept this letter and thought about this letter and contemplated this letter until he was able to address it. And he got this whole team together to work on it. And there's another great anecdote. I'm just trying to get you all to love him as much as I do. One of the priests or theologians that was working on this report was really important to Leo, and so he locked him in his study, in his own study, in Pope Leo's study, to work on it, so that no one would bother him. And then at noon he came with some bread and a jug of wine and visited with him for a little while, and then left and locked him back in, so that he could finish the section of Rerum Novarum that he wanted so badly. Right? So Rerum Novarum was written, likely most of you know, on the condition of the working class, which was greatly upended because of the rise of technology and the Industrial Revolution. This is what Leo XIV is talking about when he says he chose this name with the advent of AI. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution, labor was turned over. Masses of people coming out of the country into the city to work in these factories in terrible conditions with no job security and very little pay. And even working for pay was a very new idea. This idea that you would go work for someone and then your recompense would be payment was rather rare prior to the Industrial Revolution. Right? You were either working on your own land, not your own land, but on the land, and getting the fruits of your labor from the land, right? And maybe giving a portion to the Lord who owned the land. Or you had a trade and owned tools and made things and sold them to people for a price, right? Your work was very closely connected to your compensation. This idea that masses of people would go and just count how many hours they worked or count how many days they worked and then get this payment for it was very new. Remunerative labor, right? Very new. And there were all sorts of abuses because at the same time, the people who had all of the wealth and owned all of the tools and all of the factories were also arguing that the government had no place in any of this. And so they were able to do whatever they could get away with. I could talk quite a bit about that, but it created a very unjust situation, and Rerum Novarum is the church's response to it. And I've been studying Rerum Novarum now. I did the math in the car, and it was like 20 years or so that I've been reading this and teaching this document. And I've reached the point where you can really boil the whole thing down to 3 points. One is that the situation was unjust and called for a remedy. It called for a response. The injustice called for a response from Christians. 2, socialism was not the right response. Right? So rejection of that. And then he outlines the cause of the problem and its solution, which is quite simple when it's reduced to his basic assertion. Here's the cause of the problem. Quote from Rerum Novarum. Working men have been surrendered, isolated, and helpless to the hard-heartedness of employers and the greed of unchecked competition. So working men have been surrendered, isolated, and helpless to the hard-heartedness of employers and the greed of unchecked competition. Not of the free market, not of capitalism, right? But greedy men who are unchecked in their pursuit of profit against each other. He adds, a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the laboring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery itself. Right? So that's the situation, a few number of people with a lot of money, right? And then the teeming masses with next to nothing, subsistence, bare subsistence. And so all of the solutions are just different ways of stopping that. Right? Like that's why I say it's quite simple at the end of the day, right? Arguing that contracts aren't enough to protect justice, that there needs to be just wages, that workers have the right to organize, that the worker has dignity, that the owner and employer must respect. All of these different things that he says are all just ways of checking, right, this pursuit of profit. It's very similar to what John Paul II says. He says at the root of all social problems, I'm always tempted when I have students in the audience to be like, what does John Paul say is the root of all social problems? Do you still know? You'll recognize it when you hear it. I always forget which one's desire and which one's pursuit. The pursuit of profit and the desire for power at any cost. Right? That's John Paul II's summation of what causes all of the social problems in the world. The pursuit of profit and the desire of power at any cost. Right? So having authority and seeking profit are not evils in themselves, but this unchecked pursuit of it at any cost, that there's no other value that will thwart me in my pursuit. Right? The dignity of my workers, the justice of the system, the common good, whether or not this will last beyond my generation, none of these values will stop me because my goal is to pursue profit and power at any cost. Right? Same thing Leo just said, right? The greed of unchecked competition, unchecked pursuit. And so the solution, first we can recall he says there's no solution without religion in the church, right? It's the church that teaches people to see the dignity of everyone. It's the church that teaches people to pursue the common good at their own cost. It's the church that teaches people to be frugal and satisfied with what they have. It's the church that teaches people to be generous with what they have for others, right? It's the church that says to the wealthy, as Leo says to the wealthy, there's a reckoning for what you have, and it's heaven is your goal, not this life. Right? And so all the use of all your wealth and all the use of all this technology has to be ordered towards that goal. So without religion, we can't really solve the problem. So we see in Leo an interesting response to the problem posed by AI then, right? Because all of this comes together in the problem of AI. First of all, right, technology is not evil. It's just technology. Right? Electricity is not from the devil. We can have lights in the Vatican. Michael's not sure. He gave me a look like, so, maybe a little bit. Leo XIV, when he was talking to the cardinals about why he chose his name, he listed all of these principles of Vatican II. And I think Leo XIII is the father of Vatican II, right? Like his push of rapprochement, of reconciliation with the modern world. Now that we've bracketed off what we can't accept, how do we form dialogue and have relationship? Right? And Leo XIV lists this as one of his goals for his papacy, among others I could read if you like: courageous and trusting dialogue with the contemporary world in its various components and realities. So he's looking for that same type of dialogue, not a bunker church, not a hide away from the world church. But technology is just a tool, right? A tool is an amoral thing. A hammer could be used for good or for evil. Right? So any technology is that way. Leo XIV says this in an interview with Elise Allen. It's coming out as a book eventually. These are his words: "The church is not against the advancements of technology at all." He just insists then that there has to be a relationship between faith and reason, between science and faith. He says, "I think to lose that relationship between science and faith will leave science as an empty, cold shell that will do great damage to what humanity is about. And the human heart will be lost in the midst of the technological development as things are going right now." Right? So this is one of the fears, that without a theological and moral grounding, this is the problem with science always, right? Pope Leo XIII, in his pastoral on Galileo, said, Galileo was amazing and great, but he never asked why. He only ever asked how. And Benedict XVI says about science and technology, of scientists, a similar thing, that they only ask, can we do it? They never ask, should we do it, or why should we do it? It's just a question of can we? Because it gets disconnected from faith. So the discussion has to be grounded in the faith. And in who the human person is, which will be my last point. But to this point of the unregulated capitalism that we read about from Rerum Novarum, we see that at work in AI too. Right? Because AI right now is just being driven by the pursuit of profit. The demand is being somewhat artificially generated. There's all sorts of great applications, right? But there is a, if you look into the companies, there's a great pursuit of profit. If you look at any news source that covers the stock market, it's the AI, the AI, the AI, the AI. They aren't asking the questions, how will this serve the common good? Is this a good for humanity? Other people are asking these questions let's try to keep up with it kind of a way. But the technology is just being driven by sales, right? And NVIDIA wanting to sell more chips and all of this relationship. There isn't anything that's checking that. I keep thinking about, I'm prepared for the day that the article says AI has done this amazing thing. Which, I don't know about you, but so far all I've seen is that, like teddy bears are telling teenagers to kill themselves. Or look at this fake owl that looks really real, right? We're going to drain the Great Lakes so that I can have this owl lamp that moves like a real owl. What is the demand? Is there a real demand for this product, or is it just being generated by the pursuit of wealth without any thought to how AI can really serve the common good, right? Which is what it needs to be doing. And then finally, I just want to make a few points about the anthropology. So within Catholic social teaching, John Paul II sort of sums up what the church has to offer. with these kinds of problems. And he says what the church really has to offer is that the church is the expert on man. The church is the expert on the human person. Right? Because we know Jesus Christ, the incarnate God. Right? And so the fullness of what it means to be human has been revealed to us in Christ, and the church then becomes the expert on the good of the human person. And that's what they consistently offer. And what I would like to offer as my last point about AI and how, now Leo the 14th is probably, I don't know, I guess, I can't say probably, I would suspect he's mostly concerned about a reenactment of this problem where a very few people are very wealthy and the rest of the teeming masses are at a subsistence level. He talks about that in this interview with Ellen, I can't remember her last name, that this might propel us into another situation where only a very few people have the means to live a fine life, and the rest of the world is quite poor. Right? We don't want that to happen again. But my anthropological point that I want to make is just about the dignity of work itself. And maybe this comes from being a teacher and not wanting my students to cheat with ChatGPT. But I think it's a real threat of AI that isn't considered enough, right? Because we know from Catholic theology that work is good, that work was a part of God's original plan before the fall. Right? Fill the earth and subdue it. Catholic social teaching is always seen in that the natural plan of some sort of co-creation with God. Right? That our image and likeness, the image and likeness of God in us includes this creative act. And the fall only made it annoying to work, right? So after the fall, it's like by the sweat of your brow, and the earth's going to put forth thorns, and it's going to be miserable, right? It's not that it didn't exist, it's just that now we don't want to. And ever since then, we've been trying to not work, right? And try to get out of it. And Plato and all the Greek philosophers said, oh yeah, that's for stupid people and slaves, work. Right? Smart people shouldn't have to work. And then in the Middle Ages is like, that's for peasants and serfs. The nobility shouldn't have to work. Right? And since Rerum Novarum, Leo was bold enough as to say there's no shame in labor. Right? No one should be ashamed. Jesus worked. But John Paul II has this beautiful theology of work. Right? He says, man is made to be in the visible universe an image and likeness of God himself, and he is placed in it in order to subdue the earth. From the beginning, therefore, he is called to work. Work is one of the characteristics that distinguish man from the rest of creatures, whose activity for sustaining their lives cannot be called work. Only man is capable of work, and only man works. At the same time, by work occupying his existence on earth. Thus, work bears a particular mark of man and of humanity, the mark of a person operating within a community of persons. And this mark decides its interior characteristics. In its sense, it constitutes its very nature. Man is the image of God, partly through the mandate received from his Creator to subdue, to dominate the earth. Excuse me, I got a tickle. One of my favorite lines from John Paul II on work, and he also broadens work. Like work just isn't just manual labor. Work could be intellectual work, could be creative work, right? It's anything we do as part of our subduing of the earth and making it fruitful, right? In all of the different ways that we do that in our work. And John Paul says, however true it may be that man is destined for work and called to it, in the first place, work is for man and not man for work. Work is something given to us as a gift from God, as the image and likeness of God in us. He didn't make us to work. He made work for us, because it is a good for us. I used to always have to say that line, I know it by heart, because I always had to say it to my German mother, who didn't believe that. She'd say, "What have you done to justify your existence today?" Work was made for man, not man for work, Mom. Do the dishes. So, I worry too about the loss of jobs, but I worry too that people will lose this sense that we were made to do these things, right? That this is an act that is a good for us, and not just go, how can I get AI to do it for me? How can I get AI to do it for me? Father Michael Schmitz has this great video on this where he describes this as amputation, because he talks about technology and he says every technological advance expands the capacity that we have already. But then we lose that capacity because we hand it over then to the technology. And a great example that struck home for me was memory. So before the printing press, and when paper was expensive and people didn't have books, we told stories. And so people had this great capacity for memory. And I heard this talk from Father Mike while we were reading the Song of Roland in English class, which is really a song that a bard would just sit and sing at a party. I have asked my students to memorize 12 lines of it, and they're very upset with me. Right? And I'm like, there used to be people who would sing this whole thing. Right? Because their capacity for memory was so great, because they didn't have a whiteboard to write it down on. They didn't have notes in their phone. They had to remember it all. So the printing press is awesome, and these things are awesome, but our capacity, our human capacity for memory has been weakened because we've expanded it into the technology. Right? So I'm hoping that in addition to the social ramifications of it, Leo XIV will address this anthropological issue, right? That we don't just hand over our capacity to be creators and work to the AI. So hopefully my talk gave you an insight into Leo XIII and why Leo XIV might have chosen him, and what Catholic social teaching will say for us in the future. Thank you for your attention.